Welcome to Real World, Real Talk with Dr. D.Z. Cofield. The show represents captivating conversations and insightful information to encourage and inspire you with all you need to become the best you can possibly be. And now, your host for Real World, Real Talk, Dr. D.Z. Cofield.
Welcome to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. D.Z. Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and KTSUradio.com. Now, you know, one of the things I am most passionate about is education. And I tell people all the time, next to my religious experience with Jesus Christ, nothing has changed my life like my education, and it's one thing that cannot be taken away from me. But we continue to see young people, especially young people of color, who are graduating undereducated and virtually unemployable as they walk across the stage. We're getting back to that place where we are seeing more of our young people going into the criminal justice system and into the prison system than we see going to college. And the question is, what are we going to do to make a change, to make a difference? My guest today is going to help us discuss this very important matter to not just the African American community or the Latino community, but our entire society. Now, just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. If you'd like to follow me during the week, you can follow me on IG, that's Instagram, at DZ Cofield. You can follow me on Twitter at DZ Cofield, and you can follow me on Facebook at DZ Cofield. I want to thank all of you for your support as we have come out of our spring membership campaign and we're rolling full force into the summer. But listen, it has been such a trying year. I don't know about you. I just feel the need to get away. I mean, just to go woosah, right? Just to breathe. Because COVID has taken its toll. And then on top of COVID, just the normal things. I mean, I want you to think about this for a moment. COVID-19 rose to be the third leading cause of death in 2020. Number 3 in 2020, which means what? Heart disease and cancer, they were still 1 and 2. So while we saw a number of deaths and we chronicled those deaths and they were talked about each night on the evening news and talked about each morning on the morning news, we still had a number of people who were dying just of regular old diseases. And one of the things that I think all of us are going to have to deal with and address in our lives is this issue of grief. How do we make our way through the trauma that we have experienced? And we'll talk about that in some upcoming shows. But I am excited to present to you on today Dr. Ruth Lopez Turley. Professor Turley founded and directs the Houston Education Research Consortium, or HERC. It's a research practice partnership between Rice and 11 Houston area school districts that aims to improve educational equity. She also founded the National Network of Education Research Practice Partnerships, which supports almost 40 partnerships between research institutions and education agencies throughout the country. She has served in various elected and appointed positions in the American Sociological Association, the American Educational Research Association, the Society for Research, Educational Effectiveness, and the National Research Council of the National Academies, as well as the editorial boards of Sociology of Education and Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis. Professor Turley completed her undergraduate education at Stanford University and her graduate education at Harvard University. She is originally from Laredo, Texas. She is also the Kinder Institute for Urban Research Associate Director, and she is on the faculty at Rice University. We are excited to have with us on today none other than Professor Turley. Welcome to Real World, Real Talk, Professor Ruth Turley. Professor Turley, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for the invitation to be on your show. It's an honor to be here.
I'm so excited to have someone passionate about education who is doing what you're doing to help bring equity to the education of all children. I really firmly believe that if we don't recognize the genius in each of our children and see ourselves as the vessels, the tools to bring that genius out of them, then we're going to continue to see our children underperforming as they are. So let's talk a little bit about what you do and what your organization does in regards to education.
So I founded HERC, as you just mentioned. It's a research practice partnership between Rice University and 11 Houston area school districts. Our original partner was HISD, and in more recent years, we expanded to 10 additional school districts in order to really do a better job of connecting research to education decision making. But let me just back up a little bit by saying a little bit about why I'm doing this, because I think that's really important to stress. So I became really passionate about education really since my childhood. I had some experiences in early childhood that really opened my eyes, even though I didn't have the terminology for what I was seeing, but I really got to see firsthand the impact of educational inequities. I grew up in Laredo, as you just mentioned. It's a border community. My family's from Mexico, but I was born and raised in Laredo, Texas, and grew up in a very poor community. Laredo has one of the highest child poverty rates in the country, and my own family was very poor. My mother had an 8th grade education. My father had a 3rd grade education, and hey, things were tough. Things were really tough at home, but I loved school. I did well in school, but I knew early on that there were some really serious problems with our education system. In particular, I saw that certain students were treated differently in my school. I went to a predominantly Hispanic school, but there were a few white students that were treated very differently. I also saw early on that, there are some really hard-working people, to this day, the hardest working people I've ever seen, people who work so hard for so little. And I just knew that there was something wrong in the world if people can work that hard and have zero benefits, zero vacations, and just struggle every single day just to make ends meet. And that included people like, my own mother who worked so hard for so little. And then lastly, I just want to mention that I saw that the people that experienced the most injustice in their lives were people that didn't have much of an education. They were treated differently. They were excluded from a lot of things. And so I knew early on that I really wanted to do something about that. I knew that there was something wrong in the world that needed to be addressed. So when I got an opportunity to go to college, and I appreciate that you mentioned your relationship with Jesus Christ and the role that has played in your life. I share that with you, and in my own life, I hope you understand what I mean when I use the word miracle. And in my own life, I've experienced several miracles, and one of them was the fact that I was given the opportunity to go to college. But I don't want it to be so rare, so unusual, having to require a miracle from God in order for students to have the chance to go to college. It should not be that way. This should be something that's easily available to everyone. So that is what I'm working toward, and that's so I wanted to share that with you about why I do what I do.
No, so I was going to say, Dr. Turley, I really appreciate that. I think, like you, I shared that miraculous experience of, being a student living in the Jacob Riis housing projects on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and receiving a scholarship to go to a private school. And my whole world was opened up to what could be an education. Went back to public school when my family moved out of the area. And, when I went to the private school, I was a year and a half behind and had to work to catch up. And then when I went back to the public school, I was a year and a half ahead and just saw the disparities, went to a public high school, then went to a Catholic prep school, and again, saw those disparities and just recognized that the biggest difference in my educational experience was not me as a person, it was the expectations that teachers had of me and their willingness to challenge, to bring the best out of me. That I was the same kid in PS 34 that I was in Grace Episcopal Church School, but I just had different teachers who had a different mindset and who viewed me differently. As you look at your research, you started with HISD, and then you move forward from there, and now you've expanded with other districts. What are some of the common issues? Because I know there's been a lot of talk over this past year about the educational disparities that are being revealed by COVID-19, the digital divide that we talked about long before COVID-19, but the assumption that so many made that people had access to the internet and had computers and things like that. And, I talked to one school leader who told me privately that, if he had his way, he would just have everybody repeat the grade over because he just felt like, kids got little, if anything, from their educational experience by and large. There are some students who have done really well on the digital platform, but I think it's safe to say they are the exception and not the rule. What are some common issues that you are seeing and have seen that districts are dealing with that they just don't seem to get? And I would imagine that you have to face some frustration in approaching districts with data that requires a change and them not making the changes that they need to make in order to change the outcomes that they're receiving.
Well, actually, it's a good question. I have to admit that I've been very fortunate to be able to work with some really terrific district partners. Actually, there are a lot of folks in the districts that we partner with that are really doing their best with the limited resources that they have, with the many constraints that they have in the system that we all have to function in. And so the reason why I start there is because I want to come back to the systems, systemic factors. But for now, I'll just say that to answer your question about some of the common themes that have come up is really one about inequities. There are lots of inequities in terms of the educational experiences that students have. And as you mentioned, these inequities really came to light, and they were there previously, to be clear, but they were exacerbated in many ways during the pandemic. And so people are paying much more attention to these inequities than they have in the past. So even though I hate the pandemic, I hate everything that has happened as a result of it, I am glad that it has raised awareness about these pre-existing inequities. So what happened as a result of the pandemic is that these pre-existing inequities meant that different students reacted differently to the pandemic. So as you mentioned, some students, actually many students, really struggled during the pandemic. You may have heard some of the statistics around the failure rates of students. Failure rates went up significantly during the pandemic. Enrollment rates went down during the pandemic, especially for enrollment rates in early childhood. So pre-K, for example, those enrollment rates went down significantly during the pandemic. And so all of these are real concerns because in fact, in our own locally produced research, we found that pre-K is extremely important in preparing students for school. We found that students who attended full day pre-K in HISD, for example, were twice as likely to be school ready in kindergarten than students who did not. And that's huge. That's very, very significant. So it really breaks our hearts to see that, oh, now the pre-K enrollment rates have gone down. So I know that the school districts are doing a lot to try to encourage more parents to enroll their kids in pre-K, but at the same time, we need to try to meet parents where they're at and to try to understand their concerns. But we're hoping that, especially now with the vaccine being more widespread and folks being a little bit more willing to go back to school in person, that will change. But I did want to come back to the systemic factors. So there are, of course, a lot of individual factors that matter, such as, how hard students work, how well teachers teach, what parents do to support their kids' education. All of those things do matter. But I'm a sociologist. I tend to focus a bit more on society level factors, the systems that are in place that either help people or they hinder people. And so that context really matters, especially that educational context. So we're really trying to address some of these systemic factors that are, really things like, the things that determine where people live, the things that determine where children go to school and how many resources they have access to. All of those things are the kinds of systems that I'm referring to that also really matter. And the challenge is that a lot of those things are, to some extent, perhaps even to a large extent, they're out of the control of schools or school districts. So what we're trying to do here at Rice is we're saying we have these resources that we're sitting on. We need to leverage these resources, and I'm not just talking about monetary resources, but our connections are with community stakeholders, for example, and all the data that we have access to. We need to use all of those resources in order to help our community really try to address these systemic factors, and really leverage the moment that we're in, where people are paying more attention to these systemic factors, paying more attention to these inequities, or realizing the extent of these inequities. One big one that stands out to me that I wanted to share with you today, this is true both nationally and locally here in Houston, and that is that, you're talking earlier about the differences in educational experiences. Black and Hispanic students are 5 times more likely to attend a high poverty school than white students. 5 times more likely to attend a high poverty school. And to be fair to folks that work in high poverty schools, educators in high poverty schools, I want to acknowledge that there are some amazing people that are saints in my book, right? That are doing amazing work in high poverty schools. But the reality is, and research shows this, that high poverty schools struggle to recruit and retain effective teachers and administrators. They struggle to offer advanced courses. They struggle to raise money. Everything is harder in high poverty schools. So the fact that Black and Hispanic students are much more likely to attend high poverty schools is something that we need to pay attention to. Like, are we really giving them the same educational opportunities if we allow these types of disparities to continue? I don't think so.
What do you see as the role of culture in educating our children? And specifically, when I talk about culture, I think about as a closet sociologist myself, I think about, my commitment to know the people I'm serving and to make sure that I learn to speak to them through a language and a cultural lens that they understand, because I've taken time to understand them. Typically, it's very easy to identify differences in culture when we're talking about language differences. But I think one of the mistakes that we make, especially with Black and brown children, and I'll say African-American children in particular, is the belief that, because we both speak English, we think we're speaking the same language. Really not, in a very real sense. If you have teenagers, anybody who's listening today, you can speak English, but you and your children, can speak a different language, and they'll have a conversation with you or with their friends, and you can be right there listening and not understand a word that they're saying. It's that failure to me that has been so critical in the miseducation of Black and brown children in particular, because of that cultural ignorance. Is that something that you see research-wise? Because it seems like educators focus on curriculum and they focus on textbooks, and they don't focus a lot on those soft sciences of just understanding people and loving people, speaking a common language that other people speak.
Yes, you're right. You're absolutely right that culture is very, very important. The challenge with culture is that it is much more difficult to measure, much more difficult to, to keep track of, in the sense that you're referring to, that sometimes there's a misalignment. And so how do you document that in a way that can actually allow people to intervene and make sure that there is more cultural alignment? Having said that, it's not impossible. I'm just saying it's more challenging to do that. But I will say that there have been some research studies on the role of teachers with the students' ability to identify with their teachers, as you were talking about earlier. So, for example, students who can, and this is not necessarily having the same race or ethnicity, although that it can mean that. They refer to that as student-teacher congruence. But sometimes it refers to other ways of identifying with your teachers, and that can be very important in helping students stay engaged, to help them feel like they're understood, that to help them feel like they can communicate well with their teachers. That is very important. But I will add that in terms of the socio-emotional skills, as a phrase that's used sometimes to refer to these types of skills, being able to communicate well, being able to work in a team, that emotional regulation, all of those kinds of things. We are actually in the process, Houston in particular, is in the process of collecting and doing some analyses on information on the socio-emotional skills of students. Because so many people, employers, if you ask any employer, I mean, they care more about these socio-emotional skills than they do about academic performance. They want someone who can be a team player, someone that will show up on time, someone that will finish what they started, those kinds of skills that any employer would want. But they are harder to measure than our traditional academic skills. Having said that, there are these new measures out there. So HERC has been participating in an international study. Actually, it's put out by the OECD, what does it stand for? Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. They're the ones that, if you ever see international comparisons of students, they put out those international comparisons. But now they're starting to look at these socio-emotional skills. And so I just wanted to let you know that is a great question, and that is something that we're currently investigating here in Houston. I don't have results for you yet in terms of what we are finding here in Houston in terms of students' socio-emotional skills, but I just wanted to mention that we're looking into it right now, and we understand that a lot of employers seek these types of skills. Some people call them non-cognitive skills, but that's really a misnomer. They are cognitive skills too, or soft skills, things like that. But yeah, these are very important.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, and I think you make a great point, and I want our listening audience to make sure you get this. This is really not about Black teachers are the only ones who can teach Black kids, or Latino teachers are the only ones who could teach Latino children, because I know teachers who are ethnically Black but are culturally ignorant of the student body and the parents, that they're teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And my wife taught at a predominantly Latino school, and we talk a lot about culture, and she is kind of a natural sociologist. And she came home one day and she said, what does abuela mean? And I told her what it meant. And I said, why you asked me that? She said, because one of the kids called me his abuela. And I'm like, man,
That's an honor.
Right. I was like, boy, you were in. I'm like,
yeah.
But again, she understands what it means to know children and kids where they are and affirm them for who they are, really help them to see the best out of who they are wherever they are. And that's one of the things that I think we have missed, sadly, out of desegregation and out of Brown versus the Board of Education, because, I think since Brown versus the Board of Education, African-American children in particular have been put in very hostile environments and have had to be educated in a hostile environment that quite honestly does not foster educational outcomes that we want to see come from our kids. I mean, it's always better when kids feel loved and appreciated and, valued, and, not when they're demeaned and marginalized and the like. What are some of the issues that you see HERC having to deal with now across districts, now that we're coming out of COVID? Many are considering this kind of a throwaway year. And, we can argue, whether that's true or not. I know some families, it's very interesting, where one daughter just thrived on the virtual platform and did extremely well, and her sister bombed and, just did exactly the opposite. So we're seeing these disparities even within households, among siblings. But as we're coming out of this and we're getting ready to go into 2021 and the 2021 school year, the mayor of New York announced that, the largest school district in the United States is going to be opened completely coming into September. What are some of the challenges that you see us needing to address that school districts need to be aware of?
That's a great question. One of the main things that school districts are needing to address right now is making sure, well, I would say it's twofold. The first is making sure that students' basic needs are met, because so many families struggled economically, like more so than normal, struggled economically during the pandemic. And just because the pandemic seems to be winding down, hopefully it is, it doesn't mean that the economic situations of families with children have improved. So we know that a lot of families are still struggling. One of the things that HERC did with HISD is that actually right before the pandemic, HISD asked us to help them out with a student assessment of students' needs. So here we're talking about basic needs like housing and food and school supplies and healthcare needs, mental health care needs as well. So we did some analyses on these student needs in HISD, and we found that the needs are great, actually. And the crazy thing is, as I said, this was right before the pandemic, so we expect those needs to have only gone up since then. So there are things that school districts need to continue to do in order to make sure that their students' basic needs are met, because obviously a student can't learn if they're hungry, if they're homeless, if they're struggling with their mental health, they're dealing with trauma and all kinds of things. As long as those needs aren't met, of course a student is going to struggle to learn. So we shouldn't, jump over all of these basic needs and just expect all students to be ready to learn. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So the things that school districts need to do is to do everything that they can, working with partner organizations whenever possible, to make sure that those basic needs are met first.
Dr. Turley, let me interrupt you there, because I want to ask you a question. When we got word of the 15 schools that were failing east of Main Street, and they were all Black and brown schools, those were some of the issues that were present
exactly
about 5 years ago. And historically, this has been an issue. You look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? That these basic needs of children and their families were not being met, and the schools basically turned a blind eye to them. I should say the school district basically turned a blind eye to them and basically left those schools out there. What are they prepared to do different now? Because now, as you have stated, COVID was not a good thing, but it has revealed systemic issues that those of us who have been working in schools for years have been hollering about and waving our hands about, saying, hey, there's a problem over here. Now COVID has basically pulled the covers off. But the question is, what are school districts prepared to do now to address some of the issues?
I would say they're prepared to do more. And now, of course, it varies from district to district. But they have been, the districts that we're working with here in the Houston area have been doing more than ever before in terms of addressing these basic needs, precisely because the pandemic made clear that until those needs are met, you can't go on with the business of educating our children. You have to meet those basic needs first. But having said that, as you've heard about the influx of funds that these school districts are expecting to receive,
Yes.
those can really help the school districts do even more to make sure that students' basic needs are met. Now, I'm not saying that all those funds should go just toward those basic needs, but I think that some of those funds, maybe even a large portion of those funds, should go to make sure that those basic needs are met. So HISD, for example, has been hiring lots of what they call wraparound specialists. These are folks that work on campuses to make sure that students have their basic needs met, and they make sure that they're connected, that their families are connected directly with service providers. And in fact, we worked with another organization called Pro Unitas to create an interactive map that maps out students' needs across campuses, as well as the location of service providers to help folks. Anybody can go, whether you're a wraparound specialist or a family in need, or a funder that wants to help provide these. So any funders listening, you can go to that interactive map and see where the needs are if you want to support meeting those needs. But there's a second piece to that in terms of what school districts can be looking ahead in terms of what happens post-pandemic. Hopefully we can start to say that soon. That we need to make sure that, of course, we move beyond that. That's just a starting point. If we are able to meet every student's basic needs, thank God for that, but that's just the beginning. Then we need to address these larger inequities that I've been referring to earlier, about the fact that there are still these huge inequities in our education system. And to be clear, there are a lot of amazing educators and administrators that are doing their best to serve students and who love students, but they are facing serious constraints in the systems. So that's what I want us to have an eye on in terms of the future, right? Let's move past this horrible pandemic, and let's meet students' basic needs. But now let's make sure that all students are getting access to the educational opportunities that they need. And we're not there yet. We weren't there before the pandemic, and that means that we have our work cut out ahead of us post-pandemic. So some of the things that we can do is, for example, HISD asked us to take on an equity project meaning that they asked us to help them look all across the district to see what are the inequities that are in the district in 7 different areas. The inequities in terms of finances, inequities in terms of facilities, inequities in terms of human capital, how teachers are distributed, and so on, like all kinds of inequities. They want us to take a look at, district-wide, are there inequities in these areas? And if so, what kinds of things can we as a district do to address them? So I'm really excited about that project that is currently underway. And there are some briefs that have come out, research briefs that have come out already. There are more to come. The short answer is, no one's surprised, right, by this, but there are some significant inequities, and but it's wonderful that the district is saying, hey, we know that there are inequities and we want to address them. And so what I want to make clear is that, hey, I think that's great that the district is trying to address them, but the honest truth is that they won't be able to address them by themselves. If we really want to do a good job of addressing these inequities, this will require the entire community. We're all stakeholders in these efforts. Whether or not we have children, whether or not our children are poor or minorities or any, this is an issue for everybody, and we need to help them, not because they need our help, but because we need theirs. We as a society are relying on the success of all of these children. They're the future of our city and our nation and beyond, right? And so we cannot fail them in this way. So there are things that we can do to support our district's efforts to improve educational equity, but of course this goes beyond districts. This is a regional issue. This is a state issue. Don't get me started about state funding for our students. That there's a lot of room for improvement there. It's also a federal issue. There are efforts at the federal level as well.
So you just raised a couple of issues. To our listening audience, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Real World, Real Talk. I'm your host, Dr. DZ Cofield, and you're listening to your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU 90.9 on the FM dial and ktsuradio.com. Our guest today is Dr. Ruth Turley, and we're talking about education. She is, among other things, the leader of HERC, which is a group of thinkers committed to researching and finding and identifying data to share with school districts. Among her partnering groups, the Houston Independent School District. Dr. Turley, let me ask you this question. I want to talk about this funding issue a little bit, because Texas is a state that has a lot of pride. I always tell people, Texas is a place that, many people still think, they should secede from the Union, form the independent country of Texas. I'm not from Texas. I've been in Texas since 1989. And I tell people I'm still working on my green card. Because, I'm not from the state. But I think what always bothers me about Texans is, as much pride as we have, we don't seem to be moved by data. And what I mean by that is, for example, we have the 5th worst rating for affordable housing in the US. So 95% of people do better than we do when it comes to affordable housing. We talk about, we want to be number one in every area. But we're in the bottom 10% of states when it comes to education, when it comes to both outcomes and results, and when it comes to spending. And, I hate to throw shade on other states, but there's some states that are out there that when I think about them, I think about ignorance. I think about leadership and then, I look at their education and they spend, twice as much per student as we spend on students. How do we justify in our policies, in our spending, how do we justify the low amount of investment that we make in students and then wonder why we get the outcomes that we get here in the state of Texas?
Right, that we can't justify it. And the fact of the matter is, so Texas is among the 10 states in the nation with the lowest per pupil funding. Shame on us. I mean, we're among the 10 lowest states. And so for starters, we need to invest a lot more on students. And sometimes people look at the number. I mean, I think we need to spend like at least twice as much as we currently spend on students if we want to do right by them. And some people look at those numbers and they're like, oh, that's horrible. That's too high. We actually spend a lot more than that per inmate in Texas.
Right.
So why are we willing to do that? Now, to be fair, there are a lot more students than there are inmates, but per inmate, the amount that we spend is a lot higher than per student. So let's be preemptive here, right? Let's take preemptive measures and make sure that our students have the best education possible. And that actually will save us money in terms of inmates later on, right?
Right.
And I'm just talking about the money. I almost hate just talking about money because there are social costs, there are moral costs, there are other costs that I think are more significant. But let's talk about money because we can put a dollar amount and then people can understand that clearly. So some estimates have looked into. I think the Center for American Progress has estimated the impact on the U.S. economy, the impact of closing achievement gaps. So these gaps are by poverty status, gaps by race, ethnicity, and so on. They're very, very significant. And they estimate that if we close these gaps, it is expected, it would increase the nation's GDP, the gross domestic product, that it would increase the nation's GDP by like $551 billion annually. Yeah. Right. That if we close these gaps, everybody's earnings should go up. Federal, state, and local tax revenues would increase dramatically, again by over $100 billion annually. So what are we doing to ourselves? Like, we're just allowing these inequities to continue. Is coming at a really high cost. So the reason why I mentioned the cost of not closing gaps is because then when we turn around and look at the cost of investing in education, it's actually pennies, right, compared to the return on that investment. And that's just talking about the dollars, is not talking about, what happens to a society when the social costs of untapped human potential. How can we possibly allow that? Or the moral costs of prolonged injustice, like that, there are huge problems with that. But yeah, let's just start with the dollars and look at that. Like I said, with that kind of return on investment, ask any business person. Like, we're idiots for not taking this on.
No, absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And if we would ever change our perspective of school spending from a cost to investment model, actually put it on a city curve and started looking at it as a business person would look at it, would see how far-reaching the profits would be in comparison to that investment. Just for the sake of our audience, Dr. Turley, if you can just identify some of the inequities, because I think a lot of times people confuse equality with equity. And when you have conversations about inequities, they really don't understand what an inequity is when we talk about education.
I'm so glad you asked that, because yes, I should have defined that at the very beginning, because different people use it in different ways. But yes, and this is fairly common among social scientists that we distinguish between equality and equity. And in terms of education, I'm going to start off by saying I'm distinguishing between inputs and outputs. So first, inputs are like all the resources that go in to support a person's educational experience. So it could be the dollars that go into a person to support a person's education. It could refer to the human capital, the teachers that are there. It could refer to the facilities themselves. So all of those are inputs. But then the outputs are like the educational outcomes, like the performance or graduation rates, college going rates, those kinds of things. So that's what I mean by inputs and outputs. So when I use the word equity, I'm referring to equitable inputs. And the reason why I'm associating equity with inputs is because equity is defined as giving students what they need. That does not mean equality, because we recognize that not all students have the same needs. So if we're being equitable in terms of the educational resources that we're providing our students, that means that students who need more should get more than students who need less. And that sometimes is controversial for some folks, but I think it makes absolute sense. The challenge, of course, is determining how much students need, but there is research out there that gives us an idea of how much students need. So, for example, going back to the funding conversation that we just had, there are some studies that have looked at the amount of funding that a poor student would need in order to bring them up to average performance. So it's actually kind of a low bar. I'm not talking about, bringing them up to like a really high performance, but just making sure that the poorest students in our state can perform at national average. The amount of funding that would be needed to do that, we would have to more than double the amount of funding that we're currently providing our poorest students. So that's an example of an inequity that exists in our system. And if we want to make it equitable, then we need to provide a lot more funding for our students in general, but especially more funding for our poorest students if we want to give them a fair chance. But I do want to bring up equality in terms of outcomes, and just to say that that I do believe that our goal should be equality across groups. So I'll be very careful to say I'm not referring to equality across individuals. I don't expect that. That's unrealistic. We expect variation across individuals, but across groups, we should expect and frankly, we should demand equality of outcomes. For example, we should demand that Black students and Hispanic students and white students have similar graduation rates. They do not. They should have similar college enrollment rates. They do not. And so on, because we know that those things have a dramatic effect on their life chances. So we do think that it's important to demand equality of outcomes across groups. And if there are statistically significant differences across these groups, that tells us as researchers that those differences could not have been the result of they're not just by chance, that there's something actually causing those disparities. That's why we care about those outcomes, and we think that they should be equal.
I got you. So when you talk about underperforming students of color, you see consistently that happening across the board, and you just see it consistently happening over a time frame. That's something that should be alarming, because statistically that's not going to happen randomly.
That's not going to happen by chance. And furthermore, that's not explained by individual actions. So that's why I want to go back to the individual actions that I mentioned earlier. So you can't just say, oh, those students just need to study harder, They just need to, their parents need to care more about their, like I said, those things do matter, but they don't explain in aggregate these group differences. The analyses show that statistically speaking, there's something else causing that.
Right. So as we get ready to close today, what are some final thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience regarding the work that you're doing and how they can support that work? If there is a way for them to support the work, to get involved in that work. There are a lot of people who are very passionate about education. Sometimes it is a zeal, not according to knowledge. So how can they be very intentional and strategic in articulating their concern so that their voice matters and it makes a difference?
I think that's a great question. I would encourage folks who, if you want to learn more about the local research that HERC is producing in connection with these 11 school districts in the area, please go online to herc.rice.edu. So it's herc.rice.edu. All our research briefs are posted online on that website, and you can get on our newsletter as well if you would like to receive notifications whenever our research briefs are released to the public. Because we work directly with school district partners, we share them with our partners first, but then we share everything with the public once they have had a chance to respond. But I would definitely encourage you all to do that. And in addition, whether or not you have children in public schools, I strongly recommend that if you care about these issues, that you get involved. The things that I'm talking about are more at the macro level, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that individuals getting involved, whether teaching like your wife or just volunteering to help support the efforts of our educators, that is huge. That matters. That makes a big difference. I do believe in supporting our public schools. I send my kids to public schools as well, and I think that that we as a society need to support public schools because it's for the good of our society, for all of us.
Yeah. Dr. Turley, thank you for your time today. I really appreciate you sharing your insight and your expertise with our audience and helping us to understand what's going on, what's happening, shifts, changes, and more importantly, how do we move forward to create a brighter future for our society by creating a better future for our students. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
The late Vernon John said, if you see a good fight, get in it. I always add, if you don't see a good fight, start one. And I can't think of a better fight to get involved in than the fight for the education of our children. Now, most of you know my position. I'm firmly convinced that the problem in education is not curriculum. It's a culture problem. We do not value our students, our communities. We see them in a way that they are the enemies. When I've asked teachers, for example, how many of them have made home visits so that they know how their children are living, I've literally been in rooms where no hands went up. They literally had no knowledge of the communities that their children were coming from or the homes that they were going back to. When I talk to school administrators, they talk about parental involvement. Well, we have a generation of parents who need parental empowerment as much as they need parental involvement. And what's interesting is we are literally looking at now the second, and in some instances, the third generation of parents who have been educated in a desegregated educational system. Now, I know some of you are thinking, why do I harp on that? Here's why. In a segregated educational system, there was one thing that was present. And you talk to any young person who grew up and attended a segregated school, and you still hear the same testimony in those who have attended HBCUs. And you know what they talk about? The love that was there, the support that was there, to have teachers and administrators who believed in you, who said, no, you're going to give me better because I know you can do better. And they push students to be the best that they could possibly be. And we don't have that environment in many of our schools, especially in our schools of color. And so the question is, what are we going to do? Man, we are praying for Dr. Turley and her entire team, because I believe the data is going to back up what we know anecdotally to be true. Now, the question is, what are school officials going to do with the data? And will that data bring about systemic changes that need to take place? Because in a very real sense, if the system doesn't change, it doesn't matter who is the superintendent. It doesn't matter who the school board member is. At the end of the day, systems must change in order for outcomes to change. A.J. Crable would say, student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And I say adult behaviors won't change until adult beliefs change. And if we believe our children have genius in them, then I believe we'll make the changes to bring genius out of them. I'm Dr. D.Z. Cofield. You've been listening to Real World, Real Talk on your member-supported public radio station, your number one source for jazz and more, KTSU and KTSUradio.com. Stay tuned for Truth, which is coming up next with V. Michael McKay, David Goldstein, and Asia. Until next time, God bless is my prayer.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Real World, Real Talk. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified of new episodes every week. Follow us via social media using the @RWRTDZ username on all platforms: YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. To submit any comments, questions, sponsor opportunities, or future show suggestions, visit us online at rwrtdz.com or via email at info@rwrtdz.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you've been inspired to be the change you want to see in the world today. Until next time, be real, keep it real, and stay real.